This is not a 944. This is not a 300ZX, nor is it an FC RX-7. However, it is the lesser known competitor to those aforementioned three. This is a Mitsubishi Starion, the intercooled turbo, an ex-Mitsubishi Heritage car this one is actually, and I'm here with it today to take it for a drive and see, was it the halo car that Mitsubishi really needed, or did it pale in comparison to its contemporary competition? Let's take it for a drive and find out. Right, so let's start things off with a bit of a history lesson, shall we? The Mitsubishi Starion was born in 1982 and lived through to 1989. It was born as a grey import. Mitsubishi collaborated with, well, Stellantis now, FCA or Chrysler back then, to bring the Chrysler Conquest to the United States, which explains some of the slightly more bulbous bumpers and things like that to, you know, bring things into the American regulation size of things. Mitsubishi thought they needed a sports coupe, a 2+2, a bit of a halo car, and so this was born. The Starion predates the JDM boom as we know it in the late 80s and early 90s, the thing that brought us icons like the FDRX7, the A80 Supra, and the Mitsubishi Evo and that sort of thing. This existed very much in the very earliest stages of that and was built truly to compete with things like the Porsche 944 on the European side, along with some Japanese contemporaries like the FCRX7. The Starion name comes from a portmanteau, at least that's the official Mitsubishi story. It's a portmanteau between Star and Arion, Arion being the Greek mythological horse ridden by Heracles, birth of Poseidon and Demeter. It came after the equine-themed names that Mitsubishi had been coming up with over the last few years before this, those being the Colt, of course, and later on the Eclipse, which was actually named after a famous racehorse, very successful at the time. The Starion came in two body styles. There was the narrow body, or the flatty, and what we're in now, which is the wide body, affectionately named the fatty. I think the fatty looks actually amazing. It's got those wide box arches that are famed from cars of the 80s, like maybe the E30 M3 or many other examples. It's got that great stance, it sits planted on the road, and I think it looks great. It's arguably one of the most 1980s things I've seen in quite a long time. The 80s design nature of this car continued. We had the obvious pop-up headlights, which we all absolutely love. We had the slatted grille in the front, the pseudo light bar on the back. It's not a complete light bar, but there's a blackened area around where the number plate sits that helps to link those two rear lights together. It's also got a complete wraparound rear wing that goes below the rear windscreen, and that is very reminiscent of some competitors such as the Porsche 944. I think it all ties together wonderfully. This one, granted, is very slightly lowered, so the stance is a little more pronounced, but still, the wide nature of this car looks phenomenal on the road. Even the original brochure looks like a magazine from the 80s. More 80s touches continue on the interior. Everything in here is angular and squared off, everything that could be at the very least. Granted, the steering wheel and the gauges in the middle are still rounded. There's even a little potentially trypophobia-inducing little cluster of warning lights that sit between your speedometer and your tachometer. But everything else is squared off and angular. It actually looks really interesting. Even the seats are quite blocky as well. I think it looks great, but I can understand that being a little bit divisive. The front seats in this example are the Recaros. This car came with 3 different seats across its lifespan, but these are lovely. They hug you very tightly, which is true. There's not a massive amount of space in here. It's a little ergonomically challenged, and the back seats are about as spacious as the boot. Which is to say, not very spacious at all. The US version of this car featured another heavy 1980s feature in that it would have electronic seat belts. They would whir up from the A-pillar as you got into the car and sat down, reminiscent of a very similar design found in the American spec of the Testarossa as well. Now, that's not to say the seatbelts in this car aren't still rather interesting, because they are still mounted on the door, which makes getting out of this car a little bit challenging when you first get into it, because you may realize that you can't actually open the door unless you've unbelted yourself. Now, logically speaking, you wouldn't be doing that anyway, because who wants to open the door while they're driving? But still, it's a rather interesting little adjustment you have to make when it comes to living with this car. I'd say overall, this interior has held up remarkably well over the last near 40 years. There aren't really any rattles or anything like that. You may hear the occasional bit of diff whine or gearbox noise because there's a lot of polybushing going on in this example, but it's remarkably well put together. The dash is not known to crack in these cars. It's, you know, everything is solid. There is soft touch on the doors. It's really nice for an 80s car, and especially a Japanese 80s car. Another area where this car excels is in that powertrain. It's powered by a 2-litre inline-4, the famed 4G63 that would later live to go on in the Mitsubishi Eclipse and Evolution, albeit in the slightly spicier dual overhead cam version of this engine. But still, it is remarkably potent. In this car, it puts out at spec around 176 horsepower, which doesn't sound like a massive amount, but these cars weighed between 1,100 and 1,400 kilos. This one's somewhere in the middle of that. And it shoves you when you get into boost. Now, being in boost is rather essential in this car. Of course, going back to it being an 80s car, there is a little bit of turbo lag. And to be honest, it's not the worst that I've had to deal with. I've been in modern cars with worse turbo lag than this. I was driving a Mark V Golf just the other day, and I think that had a little worse turbo lag than this does. But once you're in boost, it pulls, and when you stay in boost, it doesn't really drop off as you get higher up in your rev range. It's a remarkably lovely little powertrain, even if a little bit laggy, but again, that is just it being a product of its time. True to the Japanese trends of the time, this 4G63 is mated to a lovely little 5-speed manual. It is a good box. It's relatively precise. It's not too vague like a lot of manual boxes of the time were, and its ratios are good, well spaced. Good for touring, actually. I'm in 5th gear now at 40 miles an hour, and I'm barely even touching 1500 RPM. Now, speaking of that gearbox, I love shifting with it, that I will give it, but the pedal spacing is not the most conducive to heel and toe. That throttle pedal sits rather high, and so when you're on the brakes, you don't have to be burying them per se, but even if you're remotely depressing them, that pedal will be so much further below the throttle that it's difficult to get your heel up. You end up sort of toe and toeing if you have feet that are large enough. That, and in all manual cars, there's a common misconception that there are 3, when in fact there are 4 pedals. There's your accelerator, your brake, your clutch, and that lovely little 4th sits to the left of the clutch. That's your dead pedal. In this car, it is nigh on non-existent. It's there, but it sort of sits below the clutch pedal, which is an odd sensation when you're trying to go cruising about. You end up putting your foot underneath the clutch and praying that you don't need to change down in a hurry. But it's there, so it's comfortable, I guess. But again, 80s ergonomics are, you know, a little difficult. Having said that, at 6'3", I fit in this car remarkably well. I'm seated relatively far back and my legs are a little bit crushed up, but you know, it's not that bad. My feet are in central line with the rest of my body. I don't have to worry too much about that. Steering wheel is still decently within reach. Obviously, we don't have anything telescopic or tilting or anything fancy like that. This is still a car from 1988, this specific example. But ergonomically, it's not too bad. Everything sort of just works. And I think that might be the Japanese thing. Europe hadn't necessarily quite figured it out. The Americans, they had no chance. The Italians, let's not even mention those guys. But this is a remarkably well set up little car, I think. Where things start to fall apart a little bit is in the steering. Many cars of this era had already moved on to rack and pinion, but the Starion was lagging a little bit behind. We still have recirculating ball steering, a steering box, which, you know, isn't terrible once you're actually in the corners. The feel is decent and the control is fine, but on center, I mean, that's maybe 5 degrees either way, and nothing is happening. There is a lot of play, a lot of deadness on center, which, you know, is fine if you're driving this car through corners and twisty roads like the glorious British B roads I've been blessed with today. But once you're on the motorway, you do find yourself drifting a little bit in your lane, which is fine in most cases, but again, you just have to be paying that little bit of extra attention. Other drivetrain features, we've got a limited slip diff in the rear. It is a mechanical LSD and that's fine, but it hooks up well, it goes, and if you're brave enough and if you can figure out this turbo power band, then I imagine you could probably stick the back end out. But again, I'm not brave enough and I have not spent nearly enough seat time in this car to have that all figured out. But still, it's there and it's good for the corners. It definitely hooks up and it pulls you through very nicely indeed. Another area where the Starion was remarkably impressive was in its racing pedigree. Mitsubishi entered this thing into pretty much any series they could, from Group A Rally, which it was remarkably successful in, all the way through to several SECA events. It even finished the 1985 Longest Day of Nelson, which is a 24-hour race. And it finished first, despite sustaining what's quoted as heavy rollover damage. This thing was clearly in a world of its own, and Mitsubishi put that pedigree to great success in later cars, even if they did kill this thing off a little bit early. So, you would think, based on what I've said so far, the Mitsubishi had put themselves together quite a decent little package, and you'd be right, they had. But how did it stack up against the competition at the time? Now, the main competition for this car, I reckon, was probably the Porsche 944. That car, or specifically the 944 Turbo, was a great little bit of kit. It was quick. It was actually quicker than this by a little ways. The S2, I think, brought it all the way up to more than 240 horsepower in some trims. But that's not to say that this wasn't without its advantages. And it actually had some advantages that Porsche had to license. Specifically, the balance shaft on the 944 originally had a 3-bearing design, and Porsche weren't very happy with it. It wasn't very good for all intents and purposes. So Mitsubishi came along. Oh, there goes that LSD. Sorry, Chapman. So Mitsubishi licensed them their own balance shaft, which they used on this car, at a cost of a whopping $8 per car, which is a lot of money, especially in the 1980s. And I imagine Porsche lost on quite a bit of profit margin because of that. Now, this car still had other competition to deal with though, most notably in the FC RX-7. It had a lot more torque down low, but the RX-7 was lighter, and people generally liked that racier, higher strung rotary engine, especially with its response in the upper rev ranges, which this car just didn't quite match with its single overhead cam 2-litre inline 4. Now, that wasn't all. The 300ZX also was more powerful than it, albeit quite a bit heavier too. Now, that kind of solidified the 300ZX's place as a GT, a Grand Tourer. It was quick, but it was comfy, and that is generally what people were looking for in that car. Therein lies what I think is the main problem with the Starion, in that, yeah, it was quick enough, yeah, it handled well enough, if even a little bit vague on center, and yeah, it was comfortable enough, but it didn't really pick one. It didn't specify like those other cars did. And that's where I think the problem is with this car. It does everything pretty well, but nothing amazingly. It's a jack of all trades and a master of none. And I think that's a massive shame, because this thing looks amazing, it sounds good, and it drives well, but it just fell under the radar for people because there just wasn't enough interest. And that is part of why it led Mitsubishi to cancel it in such a short space of time. It lasted only 7 years as a model before it went out and was replaced by the front wheel or all-wheel drive Eclipse. And this car could have been an amazing sports car. Right now, it's sort of reduced to a cult classic. A cult classic that I and many others love, but still one that not enough people remember. So, with that, it's time to end. I love this little thing, but I love you guys a little bit more. So with that, please feel free to like, subscribe if you'd like to see more of this in the future. Leave a comment, let me know what you think about this. Had you heard of it? Have you ever seen one? Because this is the only one I've ever seen. And I will be seeing you very soon indeed. Cheers. Now I do get out of here. What are you doing? Ugh.